2, 1, go.
Hey, Luke, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Patrick. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I love intros where we have to address one another as if we don't know each other. I'm just kidding. This is going to be our third installment of our Sermon Talkback series. We skipped last week for Easter, not because we didn't think that the sermon wasn't good enough. We thought that it was actually excellent and that it kind of stood on its own. And I encourage anyone that hasn't gone to watch Rob's Easter sermon from last week. I encourage them to go do so. It was great. And I thought it was really moving and timely. And we're also going to kind of touch on that sermon was really, he even says it, it's more up in the air. It's the broad strokes of Easter and resurrection because that's a happy day. But that, the sermon this week really gets to the traction of resurrection and gets us on the road. But before we get into that,
that was nice. I like that. It gets us on the road. That was good.
Yeah, that's the title of the sermon. So I like to do that, like when they do it in movies. They never do it in sequels though. It'd be weird to be like, like Toy Story 2. All right, I digress. Luke, tell us who you are. They know you, but tell us how they can get in touch with you as we are physically distant.
So, hey, Luke, one of our pastors. Best way to get a hold of me is llingle@centralumc.org, and my cell phone is also on our website. If you call the church and hit my my link for our church number, it actually rings on my cell phone. So all that's there, and
that's a bold strategy. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it does filter a little bit, which is nice, but you can still reach me that way, and it's really easy. And just missing seeing everybody, but also thankful for all of our connections that we were able to make virtually.
Right on. Well, this week, like I said, the sermon was entitled "On the Road," and it was Rob kind of bringing us to where how resurrection is lived out, and he starts by giving a really beautiful description of a really sad day for him when they did the interment for his father, and the experience he had during that, and how holy that experience felt, seeing the owl and everything. And he ties that in with some days it feels like resurrection was actually the hardest. Like, yes, we've had Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday, and those are really heavy. But it almost probably for the first disciples felt like no one really got what was going on. Just like Rob, as he's driving to the church, looking at all these people that are in a park or riding their bicycles, and it's like none of them really understand what's going on around him, that this is like a special day for him or a heavy day for him. And the disciples felt that way. I was just wondering, are you feeling right now during this time that resurrection is harder to grasp onto, or has resurrection seemed hard during this time of physical distancing, or even just this Holy Week in general?
I'll start with first, I thought Rob's metaphor. I mean, is there anybody better about telling a story? I mean, good
I don't
gosh.
think so.
I just want to say that if I get to be on the sermon talkbacks, good Lord, what an appropriate story. And one of the things that I thought about with it is, I think we all have difficult experiences that we kind of look around like, why is anybody noticing kind of the metaphor that he used? But then on the converse, I think that sometimes we have really positive experiences, and it's like, why aren't you happy?
Yeah.
And I think so in particular to your question about Holy Week and resurrection and kind of how am I feeling in the midst of this experience that we're all having. I think for me, Holy Week was one of the most intentional Holy Weeks that I've ever experienced, because in order to get everybody online and have our stuff available and, prayer at noon, we had to be really intentional. And, this is something that we've done every year I've done every year pretty much my entire life, is had a Holy Week that I participated in.
Yeah.
And I'm really thankful for how intentional this one was.
Yeah.
Maybe not for the reason that it was that intentional, but what I'm wondering what I learned for next year's Holy Week.
Yeah. And I wanted to commend you. You know, oftentimes in doing this, it's a time for me to kind of pull back the curtain as well for our congregation. Like, you probably noticed recently that Steve has a new camera that faces us, and it'll look as if Luke isn't looking directly at Rob while he's preaching, and that's because often he's not. He has his phone, his iPad, and a computer up in front of him, making sure that all three streams are working simultaneously. And like the intentionality is both challenging, but I think inspiring. So I wanted to commend you on, you know, just how intentional you are about focusing on that, and that you are looking at the big picture, that this isn't just, we're intentional right now about this, but that, you know, some of these things, though they're frustrating in the moment, will kind of bleed into how we remain connected in the future when we are back together and things are different. So I wanted to commend you on that. And I wanted to echo that sentiment, that this has been a much more intense intentionality time, you know, like how do we get everything in to try to make it feel like Holy Week for our congregation and for ourselves, you know?
Thank you for that. And the other thing that I was thinking, as far as resurrection, that the first part of Rob's sermon reminded me, and something having had a life experience when our daughter passed away, that was one of those moments, like, how are people getting up in the morning? Which I think is probably how the disciples felt when losing, losing Jesus that dramatically with crucifixion. Not just in general losing somebody, but losing somebody that dramatically. It's like, how do you even get up in the morning? Which I think is kind of like the walk to Emmaus story to a certain extent. Like, you know, what rock have you been hiding under?
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm reminded every year at Holy Week that I hope I don't forget throughout the year is that even the saddest moments bring us opportunity for resurrection. And that's part of what we learn in the resurrection story. And I'm not saying that it's easy. Resurrection is not easy.
Yeah.
And finding those resurrection moments are not easy, but they are possible. And that to me is hopeful.
Yeah. And that really kind of dovetails into what I was going to ask you next, which is, you know, finding those resurrection moments. And often you can look at others and say, like, how are you missing this? Just like those disciples on the road to Emmaus are saying to this, you know, drifter on the road, like, hey, where have you been? Only then to realize that it's Jesus. And this is the part of the sermon that you and I talked about yesterday and today before we got started, that we kind of really enjoyed, where Rob is saying, you know, how are we going to kind of sharpen the tools for recognizing Jesus? Because Jesus shows up as a comber, or, you know, this a gardener, all these other things. And then Rob kind of is saying, you know, we have to broaden our view and not be siloed. And then he goes on to say we have to look for the re moments, you know, the resurrection, the rebirth, the renewal, you know, and so he was kind of giving us those tools. And I think, you know, some among us do that better. Like Anne has really been pushing our children to do like a scavenger hunt, like go and look around your house for something that brings you joy or something that reminds you of the love of God. And so this is like broadening our children's understanding of what's going on. But I think that Rob was kind of calling us to the same thing. And not to speak for you, but I know that you and I say that we're relational beings. And so for us, we see Jesus in our relationships with others, in the faith, and in the love that is shared between other people. And so I wanted to ask you, you know, how, one, on a level just during the year, can we as, you know, people following Jesus, how can we expand the way that we look for Jesus? And then now during this time of separation, when if that's the way that you look for Jesus is in the gathering, how are we still doing that? How can we still experience Jesus and that resurrection Lord during this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to answer kind of the first way, like how does it happen maybe pre-COVID? I think we go back to that intentionality of the time we spend with friends and family and neighbors and coworkers. And then one of the things that I'm learning right now, and I want to caveat this by saying that I would not have chosen to learn this way. I mean, no one chooses a global pandemic and all the folks that are suffering because of this in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I'm learning is how this is pushing me to slow down. And I think pushing society to slow down. We were on morning prayer. I was on morning prayer a couple of weeks ago, and one of the folks on the call said, will we just step right back on the hamster wheel after all this is over? Or will we pay attention? And one of the things I think about with that is how we pass people during the day and never actually see them. Whether it be somebody in the office where we work, or somebody at school, or somebody where we go out to eat, or a grocery store. And I wonder how this experience could inform our ability to slow down and actually see people.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the question, right, on the road to Emmaus. Is like Jesus is there, and he illuminates the scripture, and it wasn't until the breaking of bread that he was actually seen. And on the one sense, like, maybe God looks different to us at different times. And on the other sense, like, the disciples were so caught up in their thing that they couldn't see. And I wonder if there's something we can learn from that.
I think that's really well said. Have you considered, preaching or being a minister as a vocation? No, that's a really great way to say that, perhaps they didn't recognize him because he looked different, or perhaps it was because they were engulfed in the weight of what was going on and the movement and the speed of all these things, that they just missed the person that was the closest to them. I think that's really, really well said. But it does bring us to my last question, and kind of what Rob's sermon title was about. And he said, he didn't come to this on his own through reading commentaries he got here, but that it's interesting that this encounter with Jesus took place on the road, and so many others, they took place on the beach or behind closed doors and everything, but that the road as the setting for this encounter with Jesus is important, because the disciples were people of the road. Jesus had sent them out. He'd already given them kind of the tools to living off the road, and that they were kind of called, the early Christians, this early movement was called the Way, or, almost the people of the road, that, like they were a group of people that knew this setting intimately. And Rob brings it all together, as he always does, by saying, how church becomes church, how we become the body of Christ in the world, is when we take what we've learned and we take the resurrection and we put it on the road, and that we give this big idea of the love of God that could not be nailed down and could not be hid away in a tomb. And we take that really heady, big idea and we put it into action on the road. And so Rob goes on to say, this is what it means to love your neighbor, to kind of do the works of the church. And I just want to know, because I think that is so powerful, and I agree with him, but how do we do that? How do we bring church to the road when many of our roads or ways to get to the road are closed right now?
Right.
Now the roads are moving a lot quicker. You can get from South Asheville to town lickety split, but what does it mean?
That 26 is not packed.
No, 26 is smooth sailing. But what does it mean to bring it to the road? To do these things.
Yeah. So I think part of what I think about in this passage and in what Rob preached on the road is I try to remember what Jesus was doing in Jerusalem. So it's kind of twofold. One is he was, in the gospel, he talks about he set his face for Jerusalem to fulfill the prophecy. Part of that's becoming the Messiah. And then the other part is that he's going to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage, because Passover was a pilgrimage for Jewish folks is a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Jewish folks every year. And part of what I think is intriguing with this line of thought is pilgrimage theology has been so reforming and reshaping for me over the last few years. And what does it mean when we remember that we follow a pilgrim Messiah? And so it's less about getting back out on the roads that we were on before all this had happened, and more about reframing our lives and seeing our existence as a pilgrimage, and how we experience the world is how we pilgrim towards the places God is calling us, and recognizing that part of that pilgrimage is how we love God and love each other. And getting back to kind of the question that you were raising is, how is it that we love each other well during this time? And I think that's such an important question. It's one that each of our staff members, you and Ann and Andrew and Lisa and our office staff have all been, I mean, program office all across the board have been asking. It's how do we love each other well, whether it be a phone call or a note. And then part of me began wondering, like, why we ever stop those things. You know, like we send notes to people. I mean, I watched The Last Dance last night, the first 2 episodes with Michael Jordan, and he talked about getting stamps from his mom so he could send letters back and forth. And how personal that is and intimate. And yet we don't do those things, but we're so supposedly more connected. Like, this is a real opportunity to rethink that and how we journey together, which is why the pilgrim theology lens I think is so important. And not to like be too previewy, but this is exactly what we're going to talk about this week in our sermon this coming week. When you and Lisa and me and Rob all have a conversation about how we love God and love neighbor on this journey that we're all on together.
Which I'm glad you didn't give away too many secrets, you know, before we get to preaching, because I know that everyone really likes the conversational sermons, and I know that we do as well, because there is so much planning and intentionality, and also so much just off the cuff. So I'm glad that you gave a nice, succinct preview without giving away kind of what we're doing. But I think that's really well said, and especially when talking about, you know, if you look at the first question and this last question, kind of our answers, the intentionality that we've had, and we're really connected to people, but we're only connected for smaller amounts of time during the week. We're hardly seeing people or because we're all so busy with our own lives. And now, because we've been able to slow down, we're realizing that we were connected, but now that we've lost some of those other things, we need to reconnect in ways that we used to. And I think that Central, as a church, we've been really, really trying, and we talked about the program staff, but I know that our Stephen ministers and others have really lent their voices and the ways that they can help us, and other people just sending us notes at the church has just been, it's really inspiring for me to see that we are still trying to get out on the road together. We're still trying to, whether that's physically or virtually, we are trying to journey on the information superhighway to one another. You know, we are really trying to make these things, these inroads, so to speak. But, well, I only had 3 questions. I told you I'd get you out of here quick, but I did want to say I'm very thankful for your leadership and vision for our church. One of the reasons that we are able to connect in the ways that we are is because we kind of saw not where this thing was going, but we saw that we were going to need to be nimble. And your leadership really helped us there, and you and Rob kind of shepherding us in the right direction. So I'm very grateful for that, and for you taking time to talk to me today. which, I wish we could have done this podcast playing around to golf, but the video component kind of hinders that, but that's okay.
we'll figure it out. We'll get our what are those, the video recorders that like move up and down really easy? We'll get us one of those or something.
Yeah, I'll get us one of those, something real stable. Well,
thanks,
Luke,
Patrick. This is great,
I'm
man.
very thankful. Of course. I'll talk to you soon.
See you later, man. Thanks.
All right. Bye.